Hey everybody, welcome back to Sip and Talk. I'm Joe. And as always, I'm ready to dive into some seriously juicy info with you all today. It's like we're mixing up a knowledge cocktail here. Strong stuff, but oh, so smooth going down.
And I'm Sunny, your friendly neighborhood fact checker. I'll make sure we get all the ingredients right. Speaking of mixing things up, you know what's always a good blend? Travel whiskey and discovering awesome new things. You have to check out our friend Micky's YouTube channel, Mickytolife.
Yeah, Mickey's the best. He's always got something cool going on. Okay, let's unpack this China winning against the U.S. Is that really what people think? I mean, you definitely hear it out there, right?
Oh, yeah. And what's fascinating right off the bat is just how confident some people are when they answer that. There's this real conviction.
Exactly. We actually found a quick little audio snippet that kind of captures this feeling. Have a listen.
Okay. Short, confident-sounding audio snippet plays.
China is fully prepared to fight to the very end. We don't care. China has been here for 5,000 years. Most of the time, there was no United States, and we survived.
Oh, absolutely. China's time is coming. They'll be number one, no question.
So you hear that, right? That's the level of certainty we're talking about.
Wow. Yeah. No hesitation there.
Not at all. So today, we're doing a deep dive into this big, complicated idea, the possibility of China eventually, winning against the United States.
And you sent us a fantastic range of sources to look at. Really interesting stuff.
Yeah, everything from, serious academic analyses of Chinese patriotism and the People's Daily to news articles giving all sorts of different viewpoints, and even that YouTube interview with Yuan Li, the New York Times journalist. Quite a mix.
It seems like you're really trying to get your head around the nuances here, digging deeper than just the headlines.
Bingo, exactly. What are the underlying beliefs? What's the historical context shaping these views? And importantly, what are the potential pitfalls or challenges to that prediction? We're going to try and unpack it all.
And maybe also think about what winning even means in this context. It's not like a war with a clear surrender.
That's a really good point. Definitely something to keep in mind. But first, let's maybe outline the key areas we're going to explore based on all the interesting material you sent over.
Okay.
We're going to start by looking at this concept, this idea that Chinese people have a really high tolerance for hardship. The phrase GE.
Right, eating bitterness.
Yeah.
And as we saw in that Yuan Li interview, it's something the Chinese government has, historically relied on quite a bit, this capacity of the population to endure difficult times.
Exactly. Then we'll get into the reasons why many people seem to believe China will ultimately come out ahead. What's driving that confidence? After that, we'll delve into the historical background, trying to understand why there appears to be this, let's say, general acceptance or maybe tolerance of the government there. The CCP.
That's a big question.
It is. And finally, we'll tackle this potentially quite tricky subject of forced patriotism and the idea that the party is somehow always right.
Okay, sounds like a plan. And we'll approach this critically but fairly, right? Sticking to what the sources actually say to build a well-rounded picture.
Absolutely. Let's get started then. So this idea of enduring hardship, the Qi King, Yuan Li, the journalist, she made a really interesting point in that interview.
Yeah, I remember that. She talked about the government's long history of asking people to put up with a lot.
Right, and she even contrasted it with maybe the capacity of the U.S. government to ask the same thing of its citizens. It's a different dynamic.
And when you look at the historical context provided in that excerpt on historical background and collective memory, it really lays out how this capacity for endurance might have been forged.
It really does. I mean, it talks about these incredibly difficult periods, the Great Leap Forward, the 3 years of natural disasters. We're talking about massive famine, tens of millions of deaths, just unimaginable hardship.
Yeah. And then you had the Cultural Revolution right after, with all the social chaos, the suppression of thought, persecution.
And even before the reforms really kicked in, just the general era of material shortages.
Yeah.
Living through that shapes a population, right?
Absolutely. And the source argues that these repeated experiences really embedded this cultural view. Eating bitterness is a virtue and patience is the norm.
And crucially, during those times, questioning or resisting wasn't really an option, or at least not one that was widely available or safe.
Right. Which, as that source points out, is quite different from the American context.
Yeah, the suggestion there is that tolerance for hardship might be lower here. Maybe because of the democratic system, the focus on individual rights, the media constantly scrutinizing things.
If things get too bad for too long here, people tend to speak up, protest, vote differently. There are mechanisms for expressing dissatisfaction that weren't necessarily present or effective there.
Exactly. And the other piece, the one labeled Mwipuko2, just pasted text, adds another layer. It suggests eating bitterness isn't just passive endurance.
Oh, right. It's framed as like a means to an end.
Yeah, like it's linked to hopes for a better future, for upward mobility. Plus, there's social pressure, and the government narratives often frame hardship as honorable sacrifice. Think about the narrative around the COVID lockdowns, for instance.
That framing of collective sacrifice for a future good. It's powerful.
So that excerpt then raises the key question, tying it back to our main topic. Is this Yijing Rinali, this resilience in adversity, is it actually a strategic asset for China in its long-term competition with the U.S.?
That's a fascinating way to put it. Like, does having a population potentially more willing to weather economic storms or international pressure give them an edge?
It certainly seems like a factor you'd have to consider, right, in any kind of prolonged competition or rivalry.
Definitely. Okay, so if that's part of the foundation, what about the actual reasons people believe China will win? Moving on to that.
Right. So the Korea GT,
Yes.
the positive views piece, talks about this rising nationalism and just a growing confidence in the Chinese system itself.
Yeah, what jumped out at me there was the mention of that Eurasia Group Foundation survey. It apparently showed some skepticism towards American democracy among people in certain regions.
Implying, maybe, that they see flaws in the U.S. system while feeling their own is gaining strength.
That seems to be the implication, yeah. A belief that their model is maybe better suited for the future.
And that source also highlights China's expanding economic influence. You know, things like the Belt and Road Initiative. That's a massive global project.
Huge footprint. And that connects directly to the shift in nationalism described in the 4 Characteristics of New Era Nationalism article. Well, it suggests nationalism is moving away from like a focus on past humiliation and victimhood towards a narrative of China rising, being confident, taking its place on the world stage, and that's directly linked to its increased economic and political standing.
I see. So it's less about looking back at the century of humiliation and more about looking forward to future greatness.
Exactly. The article calls it a shift from passive, reactive nationalism to something more proactive and assertive. China trying to shape events, not just react to them.
That's a really key distinction.
Yeah.
And the positive view source also mentions those big technological advancements.
Right. AI, 5G, electric vehicles, that push for independent R&D is seen as crucial. Like, we don't need to rely on the West anymore. We can lead.
Which, if you believe you're becoming a tech leader, would definitely fuel confidence about the future, about winning.
Absolutely. So it seems like this belief is fueled by a mix of things. Economic clout, technological progress, and this evolving, more confident national identity.
Makes sense. It's a compelling narrative, at least internally.
Okay, so that leads us to the next piece. The historical context for why people might accept or tolerate the CCP government to the extent they seem to. This is often puzzling for outsiders.
Yeah, it's a big one. That excerpt, do Chinese people generally believe the party is always right? Dives into this.
And a key factor it points to is the role of political propaganda and the education system in shaping that view over decades.
Right. There was that quote from the People's Daily in there that was quite revealing, something about changing what needs to be changed, but never changing what shouldn't be changed.
Yeah, the dialectics of history have taught Chinese communists what should be changed must be changed, otherwise it will decline. What should not be changed must never be changed, otherwise it will disintegrate.
So it projects this image of like adaptability, but also unwavering core correctness. We adjust tactics, but the overall path is right.
Precisely. And that perception can be reinforced by things like those high government satisfaction numbers you sometimes see reported in surveys, like that Harvard Kennedy School poll from 2020.
Though we should probably be careful interpreting poll data from that environment, right?
Absolutely. Always need context. But the perception of high satisfaction, whether accurate or not, can definitely bolster trust in the party.
And then there's the huge factor of media control and censorship. If dissenting views are limited and the information flow is managed,
it can create an impression of near unanimous public opinion, or at least make it very difficult for alternative views to gain traction.
The New Era Nationalism article also mentioned how the CCP has really worked to frame itself as like the pillar of the nation, the protector of China's interests.
Yeah, effectively tying patriotism, loving the country directly to loving the party, making them seem inseparable.
Which is a very powerful connection to make. But the Always Right excerpt did bring up counterpoints too, didn't it?
It did. It raised important questions about, the system's ability to self-correct if mistakes are made but can't be openly discussed, and just the general value of having diverse perspectives in any society.
Right. If everyone has to agree or pretend to agree, how do you identify and fix problems effectively?
That's the inherent tension. So, yeah, complex factors behind that apparent tolerance.
Okay, so this flows naturally into that idea of forced patriotism. That People's Daily article on the history of patriotism, Tuarara, was fascinating on this.
It really was, especially how it framed patriotic education as a conscious ideological project that became more and more systematic over time.
Yeah, it broke it down into phases, right? Like pre-reform, patriotism was just sort of a label applied here and there.
Exactly. Scattered, no clear content, no real system. The article mentioned examples like everyday actions during the Korean War being called patriotic.
Then in the 80s, it became more theoretical.
Yeah, a grand theory with clearer content, but still lacking a robust way to, actually teach it systematically. That's when the loving the country equals loving socialist China idea really formed.
Okay, getting more defined.
And then the big shift from the 90s onwards, it became this engineering project. Clear content, established systems, special institutions, reading lists, those patriotic education bases you see everywhere.
Wow, a very deliberate, structured effort. The article also suggested this ramp-up was linked to the party's own perception of its legitimacy shifting, right?
Yeah, moving from just revolutionary credentials to needing performance economic growth and then adding this strong ideological patriotic component back in. It's like they needed multiple pillars for legitimacy.
Makes sense. You need to keep reinforcing the narrative. And that other article, the Chinese-style patriotism, embrace or reflect, when we gave some very current examples.
Oh, yeah. The state-organized stuff, like the light shows, military parades, the apps for making patriotic avatars, even software with a patriotic style, very visible.
But then it immediately contrasted that with the reality of opinion control, the sham, suspending accounts of intellectuals who step out of line.
Right. It highlights that tension. You can be patriotic in these approved ways, but critical reflection or dissent is often shut down.
The interviewee in that piece made a sharp point, too, about how this official patriotism often conflates the state and the regime.
Yeah, potentially obscuring the idea that citizens support public servants through taxes rather than just pledging loyalty to the party itself. It's a different understanding of the citizen-state relationship.
And that article also touched on the external impacts, raising concerns about how this nationalism affects others, mentioning the suppression related to Hong Kong or issues faced by Uyghur and Tibetan speakers abroad.
Which connects back to the point about grassroots versus official nationalism from the 4 characteristics piece. It's not purely top-down. There's genuine popular sentiment, too, which sometimes aligns with or is amplified by the official line.
So it's this mix of engineered promotion and real grassroots feeling.
Seems like it. A really dynamic interaction.
Okay, so we've covered the reasons for optimism, the historical context, the patriotism aspect. But what about the challenges? The arguments against this idea of China's inevitable victory. The opposing views piece laid some out.
Yeah, a big one is definitely negative international perceptions. That Pew Research data showing unfavorable views, particularly in the U.S. and other Western countries, that creates friction.
Absolutely. Makes cooperation harder, builds mistrust. And the fundamental differences in political systems and values, that's a constant underlying tension, too.
Plus, the excerpt reminded us about the internal challenges China faces. Things like the aging population, youth unemployment. These are significant domestic hurdles.
They really are. And going back to Yuan Li's interview, that observation she shared was striking about some people in China seeing parallels between U.S. political turmoil and their own cultural revolution.
That's pretty sobering. Suggests anxieties about stability and direction maybe exist on both sides, or at least are perceived that way by some.
And his excerpts had some cautionary points, too. One argued that resilience, that eating bitterness ability, while a strength, well, it doesn't automatically translate into other necessary things.
Right, like creativity, institutional advantages, genuine tech leadership, or high-quality economic development. Being tough doesn't guarantee you'll innovate better or faster.
It might stop you from falling down, as the source implied, but doesn't necessarily mean you surpass your opponent.
Exactly. Which is why that same source stressed the need for ongoing institutional reform, achieving real tech self-reliance, and developing soft power that cultural appeal and influence for genuine long-term success.
Things that go beyond just economic output or resilience.
And finally, there's the point about the growing middle class. As people become more prosperous, will they be as willing to eat bitterness as previous generations were? Expectations might change.
That's a huge variable for the future, definitely. So yeah, lots of potential bumps in the road for that victory narrative.
So wrapping things up, it feels like we've seen from all this material that the idea of China winning rests on a really complex base. You've got this notable resilience rooted in history, a clearly growing national pride and confidence in their system, and this very carefully cultivated patriotism, often tightly bound to the party.
But as we just discussed, that whole narrative faces some pretty major headwinds too. Internal economic and social pressures, negative global perceptions, those fundamental value differences.
Right. So whether it all adds up to some kind of inevitable victory, well, that really does seem to be an open question. The sources you gathered really show this interplay of history, politics, economics, culture, all shaping what might happen.
And it makes you think, considering the different types of patriotism we talked about.
Yeah.
You know, from just a label to this massive engineered project and all the challenges both the U.S. and China face, what kind of victory is even sustainable in the long run?
That's a great question.
Is it just about being the biggest economy or having the strongest military? Or is it something, I don't know, deeper, like global influence, innovation, maybe just the overall well-being and freedom of your people? What does winning actually look like?
That's definitely the provocative thought to leave people with. What constitutes true sustainable success in this global competition?
Yeah, this has just scratched the surface, obviously. We really hope this deep dive encourages everyone listening to maybe revisit these sources or find others, think critically about all the different angles, and keep exploring this really, really important topic.
Absolutely. It's crucial to engage with these different perspectives to form your own informed view.
Well, thanks for bringing such a fascinating collection of materials for us to chew on. Hopefully this discussion provided a clearer, maybe more nuanced picture of this whole complex issue.
It was a really interesting discussion. Lots to think about.
For sure. And hey, if you need a break after all this heavy stuff, go check out our friend Micky's YouTube channel. It's called Mickytolife. He's got some seriously funny videos over there. Good way to lighten the mood.
Yeah, definitely a good palate cleanser after a deep dive like this one.
All right, until next time.